Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Exodus Brothers. It's been a little longer than usual, so thanks for joining. I'm Micah.
And I'm Jake.
And today we're joined by Dr. Todd Phillips. Todd spent over 20 years as a megachurch pastor before embarking on a decade-long journey of questioning that ultimately led him to deconstruct his Christian faith.
Since then, he's become a viral voice online, reaching hundreds of thousands of people through TikTok and Instagram by sharing his story and encouraging honest conversations about deconstruction. As pastors' kids ourselves, we've been looking forward to this conversation because Todd brings such unique perspective. Todd, welcome to Exodus Brothers.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
We really appreciate you coming on. All right, Todd, so can you take us all back and tell us, before you were pastor, who was Todd Phillips?
Wow, before I was a pastor. So I didn't grow up in the church at all. I very little background in who God is or what he might have offered through any specific or particular religion until I was 24 years old. And so I didn't grow up with any kind of religious background or understanding. The year that really changed for me was when I was 24. I was actually going through what I would call an existential crisis. I just, things were not going well in my life. Much of the plan I had for my life in my mid-20s, I had not realized. And, there was just a lot of, I think, angst and uncertainty. And in the midst of all that, I got in touch with a very good friend of mine who I hadn't seen for several years. And I had found out from some family members that this person had become a Christian. And so I tracked him down. I was living in Denver, Colorado at the time, tracked him down back in my hometown of Austin, found him, got on the phone with him, and just basically started a conversation with him. What's the deal with Christianity? I heard you've become a Christian. What's the deal with that? And we spent the next month on the phone talking together. This was way back when you used to call collect. I don't know if you guys remember this, but you get on the phone, call collect. They would collect the charges, right? And then you'd be able to talk to them long distance. And so he covered the charges for our month of conversations. And he told me all about who Jesus was, his own transformation in his own life, and what Jesus had done for him. And said that all my uncertainty and my angst and my concerns could all go away with Jesus, and that I could be forgiven of the decisions that I'd made and things I'd done to other people, start a brand new life with Jesus, and all my sins, past, present, and even the stuff I hadn't even done yet was going to be forgiven. And so I tell people today, and I think this is something that is important. I look back now and can confidently say that if this person had told me about Hinduism or Islam or any of the other myriad religions that are out there, I likely would have fallen into that religious ideology. I was looking for something. I was desperate. I needed an anchor, a lifeline, whatever you want to call it. And Christianity was the one that was being offered to me. Now, that's not to in any way to dismiss and I do mean this, the utterly profound transformation that my life experienced as I started following these religious precepts. And so I got very involved in the church very quickly. I went from I was in a relationship with a girl in Denver. Within weeks of becoming a Christian, I left the business I had up there, the girlfriend that I had. I moved back to Austin. I think it was as quick as 3 weeks. Moved onto the couch of this gentleman that had told me about Jesus, moved on his couch in his apartment, joined his church that he went to. It was a Southern Baptist church, went forward, got baptized. And then I very, very quickly started getting invited as kind of the bad boy turned good testimony, right? So I would get invited to Sunday school classes, and that turned into being invited to church services around the city of Austin, primarily Baptist churches around the city. And between the hymns and the sermon, I would come up and give my story and tell my testimony of how God changed my life. And that eventually became kind of the pathway for me to start preaching about a year into my Christian experience. So I had I guess you would call it I dove in with everything that I had. I 2 tanks on, dove into the deep end. Realized very soon after I became a Christian and started teaching in Sunday school classes and preaching that I needed to get a formalized education. So instead of, going to a Bible study at the local church, I decided I needed to get a Master of Divinity degree and then go get a doctorate. And I really loved education. So that's, the furthering my education was to better my capability of going out there and sharing the gospel. And I was a very evangelistically passionate person. I thought everybody needed to know what I knew and what I found. And so that culminated in me becoming a megachurch pastor at some of the largest churches in the country. I worked at McLean Bible Church, largest church on the East Coast at the time, for about 7 years. And I was actually slated to take over that as the senior pastor. Lon Solomon had been there for about 30 years at the time, and the elders had put me into a transition program over 2 years to take over the church, the senior pastor role. And then Lon had decided he was going to die with the microphone on, so he stayed. And I left there. That's just part of church politics. And people always ask me, by the way, did church hurt have anything to do with your deconversion from Christianity? And the answer is no. It was just investigating the claims of Christ and the claims of Christianity over about 10 years and just finding them unconvincing. But, people assume a lot of things about why you leave Christianity. But I was there. I was at Lake Point Church in the Dallas area for about 2 years after that. And I had some very profound, amazing, just incredibly powerful years of ministry and engagement in local church communities at McLean and Lake Point. I wouldn't trade it for the world. It's just that my belief systems have changed, and that's caused me to go in a different direction.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's always been interesting to me that when people do leave a faith system, that people kind of come up with reasons for why, like you were never a true Christian, or you were part of the wrong, denomination, or you didn't pray hard enough, or these kind of things. And it's interesting because they want you to accept their personal testimony, but yet they're kind of rejecting your own testimony in that regard.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, kind of trying to pretend like the person's heart is kind of disingenuous, versus asking them and getting the reasoning behind why they did.
Yeah, and I mean, I was guilty of it too. Every changed life story that brought someone to faith in God was accepted at face value. Of course, that's the change. But anybody who deconverts, deconstructs from Christianity, none of those within the church are taken at face value, because something must be morally, ethically, character-wise wrong with this individual, because no one who comes to faith in Christ who is truly saved ever leaves the faith, right? That's the story. And that's one of the things that's been interesting over the last 6 months since the social media channels launched and I started making my message public, was just, and I'm not surprised by it, but it's still interesting. The human condition is so interesting, the way people approach this, right? And I remember, because I was these people. Right, I was on the other side of the coin, looking in and looking at my life with the same level of critique and misunderstanding that these people are now looking in on my life.
Yeah, and you did this. You were a megachurch pastor for around 20 years?
Yeah, 20 years, yeah. Megachurch, the only reason I use that term is to help people understand these large church dynamics, right? Because it's any church over 2,000. When I was in seminary, at least, that's what was considered a megachurch. And because the church dynamics are very, very different. The organizational structure, the theory behind, managing any organization over 2,000 people is very different than, say, a 500-person church. It's not better or worse. It's just different. So, yeah, I spent my entire ministry experience as a pastor for those 20 years in large church settings. So it is very unique. In fact, my doctoral cohort, the group that I was with in my doctorate program at Dallas, it was a large church cohort. So they had realized, to the point even at that educational level, to identify and structure people based on, at least in part, the size of the congregation that they were leading and associated staff. Because like at McLean Bible Church, we had over 300 staff. I mean, there are more staff members sometimes than most churches, right? So just a different environment.
Yeah, that's what I was curious about. What's the side of a megachurch pastor that most people just don't see very often? Could you talk about that a little bit?
I think people would assume this, but I would just say it out loud. I think one of the things that always surprised me was the larger the church, and this is a very big generalization, and I want to be very quick to say that. I've seen circumstances very different than this. But in general terms, the larger these churches get, the more they're defined by a cult of personality and business dynamics and business ethics. And I would say, not necessarily to the fault of the organization. When you get that large, when you have 15,000 people coming every week, when you have an internet campus, like we had at the church up in DC, we had 10 campuses around the Washington, DC area. So 10 churches, but it was all one church. And We simulcast the video to all 10 of those campuses, so everybody else was watching on screen. We had an internet campus and all these staff members at each place. And so it's necessary to build it like a business. By definition, it must be done if it's going to be done effectively. Now, one could argue whether that's a good idea or there should be mega churches and all that, and we can discuss that if you want. But purely just from a reactionary perspective, it must be built in a certain way to be effective at that size. So that's one thing. I would also say there's a sense in which, at least on social media and with the discussions I've had in the last 6 months, where all mega churches are only cult of personality. They are not real Christians. They're not teaching the true gospel. They are money motivated, all these things. And again, some mega churches are money motivated, are preaching a very strange kind of, I would call like a health and wealth gospel.
Prosperity doctrine.
Yeah, prosperity gospel or prosperity doctrine. But that wasn't the case with us. I mean, we were a very conservative Bible church with Southern Baptist kind of heritage. And our passions were driven largely by evangelism. You know, it wasn't. We counted the number of baptisms and salvations, and it was all driven around that growth dynamic. And the growth dynamic, our passion wasn't for just getting big. Our passion was for saving as many souls as possible.
Right.
And so when those are the lenses through which you see it, as you get larger and larger, you're able to, because of the finances and everything else, you're able to focus in and hire the kind of people that can take the marketing and the management skills that they have and begin to increase and add to the structure that's already working. So I think people assume that most large churches are there for the money and the power, at least in the ones I was in. I mean, that was good stuff because it let us do more evangelism. But I really did get up every day as a senior pastor and as a teaching pastor. And I mean, I felt like I had a very clear purpose from God to share the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ with the entire world, and had been given a God-given platform with internet campuses and all these other things to act as a megaphone for that message. And I was very, very, let me say again, very passionate about that. In fact, when I no longer believed, when I went through this process of a deconversion, one of the greatest sense of loss that I had in my life was a loss of a sense of very clear purpose, direction, and mission from the God of the universe. I mean, you know, and I know a lot of people listening to this will relate. When I say existential crisis, it was an existential crisis. My dark night of the soul was not weeks or months. I spent years, in many mornings not wanting, or many nights not wanting to wake up the next morning, because I lost. You know, heaven was gone. The family I was going to see was gone. Purpose was gone. Hope. That sense of passion I had every day. I was very passionate about what I did. And, you know, I can almost come to tears now. I mean, I think I'm past it. And then I talk about it again. And that loss was very severe.
Yeah. There's a lot of emotions and things that go on when you deconstruct. Some people think it's like a light switch where you just decide one day, I'm going to leave it. I'm not going to do it anymore. But it's a process. And you go through these processes of grieving. You grieve, you lose your community. Some people feel like they lose their identity. You don't know who you are anymore. What do I believe now? Who am I if my whole life was put into this belief system? So it's not an easy thing to do. And so it's not like I just decided one day, I think I want to sin. I'm going to leave. You know, it's there's way more to it behind the scenes, like you said.
Yeah, and I believe you're bringing up a very good point about people assuming that you wanted to sin, or that Satan got a hold of you somehow, or you've read the wrong books or got in with the wrong crowd or whatever it is. Again, it's anything but a long, devastatingly painstaking process of just investigating the claims that you were given. Mm-hmm. And no longer finding them convincing. It's almost boring what really happens, in the sense of, right, that what's in the minds of Christians who by and large think that something, church hurt or something major must have happened, and you're just not being honest about it.
Yeah. And you can disagree with my conclusions, but don't pretend to know that I wasn't sincere about that and honestly being honest about it, Yeah. So with you being a pastor, was there ever a point that you found yourself preaching something that you were no longer convinced of?
Oh, it's a great question. So I made a commitment there was a little bit of a critical phase in 2011 to 2013. That's when I was at Lake Point Church in Dallas. And I had made a commitment while I was there because I noticed some things. I was like, well, I have a question about this topic. And this is really the first time I'm conscious that I have a question about a topic that I normally would preach. And I made a commitment there. And I'm never going to get up on stage and talk about something I don't believe. Now, I want to say quickly too, let's say there's a pastor listening to this right now that went through deconstruction and preached 3 years stuff they didn't believe. To that person, I want to say, hey, you're on your own journey. You're doing the best you can with what you have. The fact that I didn't preach anything that I didn't believe, I'm not saying that to judge anyone who suffered through the reality of being in a career and their lives and their livelihood and their family died, everything connected to this reality while they're struggling through that. I just happen to have not had to do that. The 2 years I was at Lake Point, I did start realizing there were some topics that I would have a difficulty getting on stage, so I just didn't talk about them. But I did realize when my 2-year contract was up there in March of 2013, that's when I stopped preaching. That was my last pastoral role because I did feel, and maybe even if I wasn't conscious of it at the time, I'm like, okay, there's a whittling down, a winnowing of what I'm comfortable preaching about. And maybe I just need to spend some time finally asking some of these hard questions without having to be right every Sunday. And so although I didn't ever do that, I did come to a conscious understanding that I have a narrowing, a shorter list, a bullet point list of topics that I feel comfortable discussing. And so then from 2013, I would preach at different times, guest preach, but I would always come with the 1 or 2 or 3 sermons that I still had a passion for. And quite frankly, they were all driven around evangelism still. But some of the more difficult issues like the inerrancy of the Bible and stuff like that started to break down and really became kind of the first thread that I pulled. I would just not address those topics.
Yeah, for a lot of listeners and people in general, hearing about a deconstructed pastor is a rarity. You have a unique voice in this world. What really started the cracks in your faith? What started this whole process for you? And what was the beginning of that?
I've had a lot of time to think about this, especially since I've decided to share my story publicly. I am certain now, as I've reflected on it, that the seeds of my deconstruction began at Princeton, actually as far back as 2004 to 2006, so 20 years ago, although I wasn't aware of what was happening. I had gone to Southwestern Seminary, which is a Southern Baptist seminary. The teachers have to sign a doctrinal statement. They have to agree with the inerrancy of the Bible, for example. So it's an indoctrination school. I think anybody objectively would see that from the outside. I didn't see it from the inside. But they were indoctrinating me in Southern Baptist theology. So it was an apologetics master's degree, basically. And then I went to Princeton originally for my doctoral work. And I was in there with a cohort of another 9 men. It was all men. But I was the only of the 10 that had been picked for this international doctoral program. I was the only one that still believed the miracles of the Bible. So all the other 9 individuals were more liberal theologians, liberal theologically. It didn't matter that there was no real virgin birth or that he was either physically or spiritually resurrected from the dead, or if he resurrected at all in any way, shape, or form. Most of them were social gospel kind of guys. They were very focused on the teachings of Jesus, trying to find ways to engage in his philosophy and the dynamics of his theology as they could best understand it in the real world today. And so the entire 3 years I was at Princeton, their whole underpinning structure was a habit of mind. That was what they called it, having a habit of mind. And they taught you how to think. As basic as that sounds at a high-level doctoral program, they were teaching you how to think critically. And I read, there was a guy, Douglas John Hall, who was a theologian out of Canada, wrote a 3-volume series. It's like 3,000 or 4,000 pages, a systematic theology. And he was the first liberal theologian that I had really read. And I got to read 4,000 pages of him, and And it really got me thinking differently. I was like, man, here's a guy that's far more intelligent than me. And I figured I could pretty much handle myself in any room. By the way, side note, when I got to Princeton, Princeton was what caused me to really get humble, because I really did think I could handle myself in any room. I got to Princeton and I was the 10th smartest guy out of 10 people, in that cohort. I mean, these guys were brilliant. And the authors I was being connected with, like Douglas John Hall, were brilliant. And it was a very humbling experience for me. Now, I did leave Princeton thinking all 9 of the guys that were in my cohort were not really saved. Right. But because, again, this is not consciously changing me, but I did remember and realize when I left this going, okay, I'm thinking differently. I remember sitting down with a friend of mine who had become an atheist. This was still when I was at McLean Bible Church and doing the work at Princeton. His name is Chris. And Chris said, Todd, I wouldn't have told you this before, but now that you've gone to Princeton, he goes, what I think you're seeing is just how small American evangelical Christianity really is. He says, basically, American evangelical Christianity is the size of a postage stamp on the Christian tapestry over the last 2,000 years, which is the size of a football field. And he said, then that football field tapestry is sitting on the size of a tapestry the size of Texas, which is religious ideology. And then if you add philosophy and other paradigms, you've got the one the size of, North America. And he said, what are the odds that your postage stamp is the right version of that North American tapestry? And it was a combination of things that got me to think differently in the back of my head. Now, I had to go back and preach every Sunday, so I wasn't allowed to really investigate this at length. But that was where it began. That was my long answer to your short question. That was really where the seeds of deconstruction really began. But it wasn't until 2013 when I left large church pastoral weekly preaching work that I started to be able to ask a question really for the first time in my Christian experience. What do I think about this topic? And then spend weeks or months or sometimes years or sometimes now having been over a decade not having an answer to a question and being okay with that. But I never had the ability to investigate these things with any sense of normalcy or neutrality. And when I finally began to investigate those things, I took the habit of mind that I learned from Princeton and began to apply that to the topics of issue that were coming up in my mind and heart in the 2013 to 2020 kind of timeline.
Interesting. That must have felt like you were living a double life at that point, huh? I mean, to be preaching these things, but then questioning them at the same time. Did it feel like you were torn between the two?
I wasn't torn only because I was only preaching the stuff I was still comfortable with. Yeah. So anything I had a question about, I just tossed that into the I'm checking that out category, and it never went up on stage. So even if I was guest preaching from 2013 on, I never went anywhere other than to preach. I had 3 sermons that I really liked a lot, so I would be invited to talk about those things. And at the time I left pastoral work to lead The Last Well. It was an organization that I actually started in 2009 when I was still a pastor. And it was to bring water and the gospel to the whole nation of Liberia, to bring basic access to clean water to a country for the first time in history. And so a lot of my preaching in 2013 to 2020, because that project went till 2020, was really centered on the 2,000 passages in the Old and New Testament that talk about feeding the hungry and the poor and the needy. And I really focused in on the social aspects of the gospel and maintained a passion for that for quite some time, and feeling theologically sound about those perspectives for quite some time as well.
A big one for a lot of people that deconstruct is geography of belief. Could you talk about how that was significant to you?
Yeah, it was one of the 3 in my videos on social media. It was one of the first videos I ever did was on the geography of belief, and it being a foundational component to my deconstruction. Unnecessary suffering, divine hiddenness, geography of belief. I mean, it's familiar, I'm sure, for you too, and for a lot of listeners. It just seemed to me, and it was very disturbing, by the way, when I allowed myself to look at the real statistics. And really, again, for the first time after I left pastoral work in 2013, to just dive into the subject of the geography of belief. And it would seem to me that And I know this is obvious, but it wasn't to me at the time. But it would seem to me as I started to reflect on it that, that truth wouldn't look like a tribal. It wouldn't look tribal. It wouldn't look geographic. Truth would look eternal and unchanging and outside of culture. And everything about religious ideology reeked of cultural bias. And that geography of belief was a real blow. It really was, like a really very emotionally significant blow to me. And I sat with it. It was one of those major ones for about 6 months where I was like, and this is still when I was a Christian trying to figure all this out. And that, 8-10 years ago, it was, how do I get around this one? Like I wanted, just so you know, and for your listeners, I wanted to keep Jesus. Like I never wanted to not be a Christian ever. Like as I went through this critical phase, it was just to mature my belief and to understand the Bible better and to be a stronger Christian. And, I worked from the assumption that, like, for example, the geography of belief issue, I worked from the assumption when I first studied it and really asked some very poignant questions about it, I was certain that I would come to a godly understanding of why that happens. I must come to a godly understanding because God's sovereign and there's obviously a reason he's doing this, and I still believe he's there. So I must just be seeing this wrong, right? There's always this assumption that there's a shortcoming in my thought, my philosophy on how I'm perceiving this, the lens through which I'm seeing this. Something is wrong in me and my understanding. It cannot be wrong in God and his perfection. And therefore, as I study this, but the geography of belief was one where I came to a genuine fork in the road. It was a quandary that could not be resolved in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a big one for me too, traveling the world and meeting people who were kind and sincere and intelligent and in their beliefs, and thinking like, had I been born in this country, I would probably be, if I would have been born in India, I'd probably be, a Hindu and that kind of thing. And like realizing that forced me to think about how, like, is this based on objective truth or is it simply geography in my upbringing?
It's a game changer, isn't it? I have very good friends of mine that are very strong conservative Christians here in Austin, Texas. This is where I grew up and went to high school. And a lot of these people have never left, right? They've lived here their entire lives. And that's fine. No problem at all. I mean that, right? Everybody's living their life and choosing their story and the narrative of their life. But I wanted my children to go and travel. And this was even as a Christian, right? They went on mission trips and everything. I wanted them to see the world and see different cultures. And I will say, like you, when you finally meet people, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and they are as loving or sometimes more loving or more caring or more open, more giving and sacrificial than the kinds of Christians either you are or you are hanging around in your community, in the American evangelical community, at least for me. That's a wake-up call. And again, I remember at the beginning of that process going, well, again, this is a shortcoming in my own reasoning and understanding, right? This is not about God. It can't be. So therefore, it's just a misunderstanding of culture. And I remember thinking to myself, well, we give in different ways. And this is true. But there's a level of sacrifice when you have nothing, like all the people I served and walked alongside in Liberia. The average person makes $1 a day. Come on, it's $360 a year, and they will give you all of that, not some of it, right? This. Yeah, I know you guys have experienced it, and so those are experiential components of a person's deconstruction if they go through a deconstructed process that. It humanizes and personifies the issue, right? It's not a book I'm reading in seminary about Muslims in a 94% Muslim culture in Iran. I've been to Iran. I spent weeks there. And now that I read about them and the darkness of Islam and all this other stuff, and then I go over there and these people are just as amazing as you can possibly be. These things will rattle your cage especially as a conservative Christian. And again, I come from a very literal perspective on the Bible. That evangelical Christianity that takes the Bible very literally, and that tends to be and this is who I talk to most on my social media channels. These are the people like myself that struggle the most and find and seem to experience more existential dread as they go through this process, right? Because it was told to you that all of it is it's univocal, it's historical, it's theologically sound, and it's one story from Genesis to Revelation, and it is not. But when you come from a paradigm that tells you it is, it's very difficult to watch it shatter in front of you. And it's how it felt to me. It shattered in front of me over time.
Yeah. I've got a quote here, actually. It's the Mark Twain quote. "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts." And I think that really relates to the geography of belief idea that if you live in your little pocket and corner of the world, and the only people you know are the same people your whole life, and you never really break out of that worldview that you create for yourself, and you never really expand your views on life at all in any sense. So I think that really ties into that, relates to the geography of belief idea.
No, I couldn't agree more. Again, everybody's living their own life, and there's limits financially and otherwise for people not being able to travel. And what an amazing situation for the three of us, by the way, that for whatever reason we were born here in this generation with the three of us, at least, the finances to at least get on a plane and go travel to these places and experience them and have the live a life that allows us to even ask these questions at all.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes, it's very true.
To be able to live in a beautiful, the circumstances of our existence right now, that I can have an existential crisis and ask enough questions to go through it. I mean, I've chosen to see it that way. I didn't see it at the time when I was right in the middle of it, but not wanting to wake up. But, I look back on it now going, how privileged are we?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. And so many people try to ask these questions and they get shut down with like, well, you're leaning on your own understanding, or, these platitudes that just sort of shut down any sort of critical thinking or further investigating these things. And that's why, like, questioning, the truth is not afraid of being questioned. So, like, we should be able to ask questions, and that shouldn't be something that's hindering. And that seems to be the case for a lot of people, is they just feel like they can't ask, or they don't get sufficient answers.
Well, I'm finding that from a lot of the people on the channels, is that they were like me. I was so desperately isolated. I didn't know who to talk to. I just sat and ruminated all day, for years. And I just see people, one of my passions right now is just shortening the pain curve for people, shortening the pain timeline, shortening the isolation timeline for them, and giving them some sense of community or connection, because it's so devastating. It hurt me so badly. And I feel it when I get thousands of comments a day, not a 10 or 12. There are thousands of comments of people struggling through this stuff, and DMs and all this, I'm hurting. I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. I can't talk to anybody. I'm surrounded by Christians. My career is, maybe they're in car sales or life insurance. They can't not be a Christian and sell life insurance and cars. At least they don't believe they can sell to people around them and say they don't go to church. Right. So their entire lives are wrapped up in this religious ideology. And it's not like they can, it's not an intellectual decision. It's a whole life decision. And even if they're wrong about half of the things they fear, they're right about some of them. And so I really want to provide people at least a space to listen to maybe I'm putting to words, and this is what I hear. I'm putting to words in my videos what they're thinking. Right? Nothing special. Obviously, nothing new under the sun here. They're obviously thinking it. I'm just saying what they've been thinking, but it also says, I'm not the only one. I'm not crazy. And I relate. I wish I would have found a version of me on social media 5 years ago.
You mentioned it took you around 10 years to deconstruct. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say, the seeds of the deconstruction started at Princeton, but it wasn't until I left weekly preaching in 2013 that I started to be able to ask questions and really sit with them. And then it wasn't until about 2022, give or take, right? I never know the day, but that I would have I would have been self-described as an agnostic. And now I say on my channel that I'm an agnostic atheist. And by that, I simply mean, I don't see evidence for a God. I'm far more confident in that statement regarding the Christian God. I'm open to the concept of a God, but just haven't found any evidence to convince me in that direction. And so I'm agnostic. I don't know, I don't claim to know. And that non-resistant non-belief, I talk about all the time. I'm very comfortable there now. I'm very, very comfortable in those shoes. And I never thought I would be.
The thing that I always said was, if there was an all-knowing, all-loving God, that God would know what it would take to convince me.
Yep.
And he hasn't done it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Jake and I refer to ourselves as agnostic atheists as well.
Okay.
I think what's so powerful, Todd, about what you're doing is that it's coming from you and what your background was. And a lot of people go through this deconstruction, but the fact that you were a pastor and are now kind of doing the opposite online is a pretty powerful thing, because I think it's great people are reaching out to you and they feel you're someone they can talk to. You're creating a space for people that's really needed right now. So I just think it's amazing what you're doing out there. And I find it somewhat funny that, we're two pastors' kids here and you're a former pastor. So never could have seen this coming, right? Was there ever a point where you were praying for your faith to come back or hoping that it would come back? Or was it different than that for you?
No, yes, I asked, I was like, God, what's up? I mean, this would be the time I remember having conversations with what I thought was God. And, this would be a good time to show up. This would be a good time to throw a burning bush out. I mean, you clearly showed yourself, and this goes to divine hiddenness, right? But, you showed yourself very clearly to many people throughout history. It's a non-issue. It would cost you no energy. You desire to be with me and for me to be with you. And I've been spending my entire life working for the gospel and your efforts. And now I doubt it. And I'm just on the edge here. I can't find you. I don't feel you. I mean, there is not a single hint of your presence. And it would just seem to me, if you were there, you'd hook me up, and you're just not. And I remember saying to him too, like to this God, look, I'm a dad. And I always used to preach, we're imperfect fathers. How much more perfect is our Father in heaven? And any expression we have of love to our kids is pales in comparison to the expression of love that God has for us. And then I remember saying to him, look, if I'm 1/1,000,000th of what love is in your perfection, I know that I wouldn't leave any of my kids stranded this way. I just wouldn't. It wouldn't be a free will issue. I wouldn't be playing around with their psychology. I wouldn't do any of this. In fact, this is the exact opposite of what I would do with my children. This is not the expression of a loving God. And if I have any intuition, because your laws have been written on my heart, my intuition tells me this. And those conversations were long and, lots of tears. Yeah, I suffered through those conversations.
Yeah, we talk a lot about divine command theory on our channel as well. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Right. Is God good because he commands something, or does he command something because it's good? That whole idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting how many Christians have to throw aside the Old Testament, which is like 75% of the Bible, and like that's where all the laws came from. That's where the supposed messianic prophecies came from. So just to like set that aside and say, well, I don't believe in the Old Testament. I just have a personal relationship with Jesus.
No, I think it's a very good point. At least for the personality types that it seems that the three of us are, that's a non-starter. I mean, he's the same today and forever, yesterday, today, and forever. It's the same Old Testament God. And when you look at the Old Testament character of God, I did try to do that for a short time, by the way. I'm like, okay, maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm just going to let go for a while. Let me focus on the New Testament. So I jettisoned the Old Testament, even though that made no sense. Like I had to, there need to be a very high level of cognitive dissonance to just let go of that and disconnect it from the New Testament. But I did it for a period of time as an intellectual exercise. And then I realized very quickly that Paul and Jesus' theology were utterly different. That was such a blow, especially after being taught a certain way in these indoctrination schools and through evangelical church and preaching that they had the same theology for 20 years. The one thing that hit me, and there's many things actually, but the one thing that hit me was just, Jesus makes it very clear that not a single portion of the law will ever be cast aside until all has come to pass and there's a new heaven and new earth. And Paul very clearly says there's no need for the law anymore. We're under grace. That alone, like we could talk for 4 hours or more or days, and there are people that do so on channels about the difference between Paul and Jesus. But it comes down to that at the core for me. It's a fundamentally different perspective on the law. It's a fundamentally different perspective on grace. And Paul is teaching about this Jesus, and Jesus lived the life and supposedly said these words and performed these acts, and he never said any of those things. It's this other guy that comes in at a later date and claims to know what this man's life was all about. At some level, it's kind of a reductio absurdum. Like it's so obviously disconnected and so obviously different. I do sometimes, even now as I'm talking to you, I'm just shocked that I don't know that it was willful blindness. It was just, I was just blind to it, and I still am so very interested in the psychology of religious belief and what causes those things to happen. Because those differences are very, very clear. And so the Paul and Jesus thing, just between law and grace, I mean, just that one issue was enough to just absolutely tear it down for me. I just had an aha moment one day. I still remember it. And then what I did was I was like, okay, Paul, I'm not buying into Paul at all. He created his own religion, and here's all the reasons why. And this is what he said, and he doesn't jive with Jesus. So if I'm going to buy into anything about Christianity, I'm not going to buy into a Paulianity. I'm going to buy into a Christianity. And so then I focused on Jesus's words and actions. And then, as you know, I began to dive in for a few years I asked one question: what, if anything, can I rely on to be accurate about anything that Jesus said or did? And when I began to take a very honest, objective, critical view of the Gospels, when they were written, who they were written by, which we do not know, these are not eyewitness accounts. There's a very clear, frustratingly clear developmental theology from the earliest work of Mark all the way to John. He starts out as a human. There's no resurrection, post-resurrection accounts. And then by John, he's the Word became flesh. He's eternal. He's coexistent. I mean, all these things. And it's just when you look through the lens and you just allow yourself different paradigms and different angles through which to see the same text, and literary criticism and historical criticism, it doesn't take much. And what happened to me was finally I had to let go of the Jesus figure. I'll tell you the one thing that I did recently to try to, I'm like, well, I see all these social media accounts where people are just deciding to stay with Jesus, just the words of Jesus, the red letter Christians. And I'd already let that go, but I'm like, okay, let me look at it from one different angle. I like to do these exercises. So I actually used AI for this, but I built some AI agents in there that have my whole theological paradigms in and all my old sermons and stuff that can help dialogue with me, so to speak, about these issues. And I asked one, and I think I mentioned this before, but in a very specific way, I want to know if there's a single sentence, one phrase attributed to Jesus that is utterly unique. In other words, it's not connected to another philosophy, another religious ideology, another religious paradigm that had happened prior to, and I even got bold. I was like, even prior to the writing of the Old Testament, some 800 years prior. So I was like, prior to the entire Bible and when we understand those were written, is there anything? And this went on for 2 or 3 weeks. I actually dove into this pretty aggressively. I thought about writing a book on it. But the end of this, right? There are some unique angles in which he addressed certain topics, because we all have unique angles in which we address certain topics based on our own life experience. That is a far cry from the perfect, all-knowing, eternal God of heaven becoming flesh and providing information that only a God of that stature could provide. And there is simply nothing there. And I try not to be as emphatic on my videos as I'm sharing with you right now, but these are the feelings I currently have. Now I might be wrong, but this is where I am today, right? I could come to some different conclusions down the road, and certainly open to being wrong about everything I've said today.
Right.
But as of today, this is where I am. And those were very painful processes to go through. So that was kind of had the dismantling of my effort to try to hang on to Jesus, because I wanted to. But there are people that have found a way to stay with Jesus. And my question is always, and it's an honest question, because I'm very curious how they maintain their connection. And I'm always curious why? What about Jesus is causing you to keep his name in this process, right? Because it's, to me, you have a very different philosophy than Christianity, and you don't like Christianity, but you like Jesus. Well, the same concerns I have about how we know that anything's true in the Bible is the same concerns we have to apply to the words and actions of Jesus. Like, it does really, to me, become a house of cards, like you mentioned. You can't just jettison the Old Testament God. It's inescapably tied to Christianity. I think that's one of the biggest problems for Christianity.
Especially if you believe in the Trinity.
Yes. The one thing I find interesting is I want to know as many true things as possible and discard as many false things as possible, right? And that just seems foundational. But I'm discovering experientially in relationships with people online, that's just not the case for a lot of people. They might say it, but when it comes down to it, community is the most important thing to them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I have family members that are still in the church and have watched my videos and stuff. They're like, I don't want to watch the videos, not because I don't support you and all this. Like, they're trying to be supportive, but I don't have those questions. I just have faith in Jesus. And it doesn't matter all these things. Like, none of it matters to me. And so it's not about truth. It's about tribe. One of the things that was a death knell for me theologically for Christianity was that belief was required for salvation. If, again, there are many different perspectives, but Romans 10:9, profess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, and you will be saved. And I never allowed myself the question, and I can't honestly remember where I heard this first. It may have been like a Sam Harris or something, but that you cannot choose what you believe.
Yep.
You simply either are convinced or you're not, and that belief is a response to being convinced. It's a state of mind as a result of being convinced of something. And that was one of those really big moments for me where I was like, wait a minute, we're being held morally accountable for something we have no control over. You just need to choose to believe. Like, that is an impossible statement. I cannot do that thing that you're requiring of me. And Britt Hartley, she just did a video on some research that was done. It's 4 or 5 things that her argument is that the research shows that some people arguably need religion. They don't want it. It's not helpful. They need it psychologically, some sort of genetic development, right? There's something there. And one of the biggest issues was there are some people that just cannot live in uncertainty. They just cannot function on a daily basis with that kind of uncertainty. And I found that very interesting when I knew that intellectually. She was putting words to something I thought. But I also know that the 8 years, 10 years of my kind of existential crisis was the fact that I wasn't comfortable living in the uncertainty. Like, that certainty drove my life. It was the absolute anchor, upon which I preached and taught and lived in my life. And that certainty was the bellwether in the storm, man. And when I lost it, man, I was like, wow, this isn't comfortable. This hurts. This is painful. And it's only in the last few years, and I would say in the last year and a half, to be completely honest, and I think just self-reflective about it, that I haven't learned just to embrace. That was the key for me, just embrace the uncertainty for a few years. But now I can honestly say that I think I'm being honest when I say I can celebrate the uncertainty now. Mm-hmm. But many people can't.
Yeah, I think being humbled and having humility and being open to changing your mind is very important. And I think what you're getting at and saying, Todd, with religion and why people need it, is, to me at least, it seems like it's based out of fear of the unknown for a lot of people, and that they cling to religion and don't want to question things because it's just simpler that way. But I do really quickly just want to go back for a second, because to me, the core of your story, Todd, and really just for people listening, I really want them to know just how painful the experience was coming from the church world and walking away from your life and being a megachurch pastor and your identity in that community. Can you just explain what that was truly like, sort of making that step into actually leaving it? Because I think that's really crucial to your story.
I don't know, and I've tried in my journal, in discussions with friends and family, to put to words just how devastatingly dark was the place I was for not months, but years. My identity was not tied to Jesus. My identity was Jesus. There was no sunlight between us. Like, whatever Jesus was, or I understood Jesus was in the evangelical church, and that slant on Jesus, that perspective was everything to me. My life, my lifestyle, my actions, my words, the reasons for everything I did were driven by this very deep conviction, compulsion to do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. I felt that I had been called apart, set apart for a purpose. I woke up every day preaching. When I started the Last Well, the evangelistic work we did in Africa, every one of those choices was driven around that passionate desire to please God, not to earn anything from God, but to please him. I loved this God and wanted to please this God and felt that I was being directed by that God through the Holy Spirit, literally moment by moment. I think probably the way my brain worked is the only way I was allowed to ask questions was knowing that ultimately I was going to get answers from God. And I think that's important for people that are listening to understand. I wasn't trying to get out of Christianity. I was trying to be a better Christian, trying to get more intimacy with God, trying to follow him with greater abandon. So when I started asking questions, it was for clarity, not for deconversion, and what happened though is that as I went through the process that we've discussed today, eventually I got to a point where I just couldn't be honest with myself in the mirror that I could attach the title of Christian to myself any longer, certainly the way I had understood Christianity my entire Christian life. And the loss of that, I don't think it can be overstated. I was going to see my family in heaven. I was going to be in heaven with God in this perfect place, and it mattered to me. I used to tell my kids, don't worry about a plane ride. Don't be scared of planes, because when you're going to go, you're going to go. God's in charge of it. Like he literally knit you together in your mother's womb. You're fearfully and wonderfully made, knows every hair on your head. Psalm 139, read it before you get on the plane, because he's got this. And if you go down in a plane now, that's just taking you to heaven faster. Like I believed it all. I remember preaching to people. I got this from some other pastor, but it was a long rope across the stage, the big stages at these big churches. So the rope was probably, 60 yards long. And I would say our life is this painted part at the beginning of the rope that was like a centimeter. And this rope represents eternity. And what we do in this life is just a vapor, right? What matters is the next life. And it almost makes me sick to my stomach, honestly, when I say that out loud right now, because it's just such a horrible devaluing of this thing that we actually have. But my point in saying all that is that was this kind of preaching in life and worldview that I had. So when it fell apart, everything fell apart. Everything. My understanding of life, my sense of purpose, the passion that I had because of God just disappeared. I became very nihilistic. There is no purpose. There is no meaning. What's the point of this? It's just an accident. The pain that I'm feeling is too much. Why would anybody want to bear this anymore? My career shifted. My finances shifted. It was costly at every level in every area of my life. But the level of pain, I remember being on a call with my mother, crying, just weeping. And I said to her, I really would be better off. This is how I feel. I would be better off not waking up tomorrow. Like I'm just utterly and entirely exhausted. Emotionally, physically, it's affecting my health. It's affecting my perspective and my relationships with other people. I am isolated at a level that I never, ever imagined I would be. I'm spending all day in my head. I'm suffering. Every morning I wake up, I just want to go to bed again. It's just, oh my God, I have to be up for another 14 hours until I get to sleep again and forget about all this. Again, that's how bad things were for me. And again, I haven't shared that, I think, publicly before, but it's costly. Take this step with great care. I really thought I wouldn't feel hope again. I really thought I wouldn't feel or experience joy again. I know that sounds dramatic, but that's exactly where I was.
On that note, Todd, what would you say to people who are listening right now, who are questioning their faith and feel alone like you did? Do you have something you would say to them right now that might be helpful?
Yeah, a couple of things. So yeah, if somebody's going through what I went through, what you guys went through, and it's a recent thing for them, if they're maybe they're a Christian and just starting to question things, but really have nowhere to go. Three things, right? That number one, time does heal some wounds. And regardless of how dark the moment is right now, and I really feel very, very strongly about this, it's darkest before the dawn. Like it really, if you've got to live minute to minute, I've done that. So I know what it feels like. If it's hour to hour, day to day, week to week, if it's got to be short wins, find them. Number two, don't isolate yourself. The worst thing that you can do is isolate yourself. And it is exactly what I did for years, not months, years. And those are years lost. Now, they brought me where I am today. I don't regret. Like I am today who I am and launched these channels because of that dark night of the soul. But don't be alone. If you can't talk to anybody in your church or in your community or at work, for whatever that fear is, go online. Go to one of my channels. Go to Exodus Brothers. Go somewhere and get connected to videos and some pseudo community that you can connect to. because that isolation is the worst thing. And the third thing I would say, and I recommend to a lot of people, is counseling. Now, some people can't financially do that. And I would say there's a couple things I want to mention there. One of them is there's an organization called recoveringfromreligion.org. And I will often use their link to send to people if they've got questions. And the other one is I've talked to a lot of people that were in my space. They're either in ministry right now or pastoral work right now, or they just got out of it and they don't know what to do now. And if that's uniquely your situation, if you're listening to this, there's a group called the Clergy Project. It's an organization that allows you anonymity, and you connect with these people and they walk you through the challenges that you're dealing with in active ministry while you're questioning your faith. And there, again, Recovering from Religion and the Clergy Project, from what I know and understand, they're not trying to, they don't care where you end up. It's just about being there for you in the midst of these challenges. So no isolation, time does heal a lot of wounds, and counseling is a very good thing to consider.
Yeah, we also created this community and all these wonderful people we've met that have had similar but different stories and really connected to them and learned so much from each person that we've talked to, like you. And I think I told you, Todd, in our pre-interview call, to me, it's like building a mosaic, and each piece adds to the bigger picture of this experience. So I think everyone's voice is so important, and it's so important that we all band together and talk through our problems and talk about the hard things that people tell you shouldn't talk about, because in my mind, that's how we move through this stuff.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Todd, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your honesty, your willingness to share your story, and the thoughtful way you approach these conversations. It was a privilege to have you on.
Thank you so much.
Whether people agree with every conclusion or not, we hope this conversation encourages listeners to ask questions, think critically, and approach these topics with curiosity and compassion.
If you'd like to hear more from Todd, you can find him on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. We'll have links to all his platforms in the descriptions below, so definitely go check out his work. And if you enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts, and share this episode with someone who you think might find it meaningful. It really helps us continue having conversations like this. We'll see you next time on Exodus Brothers.